I wanted to get your take on what you thought was happening in the world that you're experiencing as you go around the world doing all these different workshops. Now, that was years ago, but I never asked that question really. And so I want to start with that. You do all these workshops, you give all these lectures, you write, you do all these things. I get a sense that there's a turning in human consciousness, which is a vague idea. We can go into it later. But I'm not always happy with what I see. Some things scare me. So what scares you? What do you, when you're out there and you see what's happening spiritually, what's frightening, if that makes sense?
Well, that's a really great question, first of all, because no one ever says, what's the dark side? What
The dark
scares
side,
you? They
yeah.
always want to know what's the sweetness and light, or the new age is coming. There's a big shift in consciousness. We just have to stand back and see it. But I think shift always has the dark and the light sides. And it's often when they bang into each other that something interesting happens. So, for example, I'm intrigued by the thought that like 1/3 of the American public are now called spiritual eclectics. So they've left their religion of origin, if indeed they had one, and most of them did. And that's been for better and for worse. So one of the things I've seen about that in the spiritual eclectic movement is people, for example, who are recovering Catholics. Done a lot of women's retreats, and we look for sacred space that's reasonably priced. We go to a convent, and people go into the convent, and oftentimes what will come up is tremendous anger, tremendous sense of, I didn't like my religion of origin, and I wasn't nurtured by it, and it was difficult for me. And then right behind that, such grief and such loss, because they might not have liked the mental ideas, but often what people are missing is a sense of connection to the sacred, the incense that's burning, the songs that are in their bones from childhood. And so I think what I've seen in the kind of shadow of the spiritual eclectic movement is there's a place of emptiness and grief over not what their tradition didn't give them, but what it did, especially before the time you can really think things through, and where they're going to get that now. And oftentimes, it's like a mental thing. People are studying this, they're studying that, but there isn't that dimension of the sacred, that dimension of the imaginal realm, the fragrances, the songs, the melodies. And I think it's a kind of dark spot of emptiness. But the other thing, of course, that you see is in response to people's leaving religions, there are just as many who are moving into a really tighter box of fundamentalism, like, ooh, the world is shifting all around me, and I better search for some safety. And that's difficult, because what you see is people beginning to oppose one another. I've seen a tremendous fear, by the way, of Muslims, as if every Muslim is a terrorist, which is just a really difficult thing to see, particularly because I tend to speak to people who think of themselves as, quote, conscious, evolved, and still there's this tremendous fear.
Yeah. Let's talk about this spiritual eclectic notion. You don't like that, it sounds like. But I always see you as part of that.
I am a spiritual
Okay, that's what I would.
Come on, well,
That's
what
what
am I?
That's what I would say. Yeah.
A
Okay.
practice apostate who started out as a Jew, who studied mystical Christianity like many of us in the 60s and the 70s. I got introduced once at a conference as, what'd they call me? They called me a Jewish, Sufi, Native American, mystical Christian psychoneuroimmunologist.
Wow.
Just like the girl next door.
You
But that was...
have a business card that's a foot long. Yeah.
But actually, it's just like the girl next door part that I think has been most wonderful for me, because I'm actually none of those things. For me, the spiritual eclectic movement personally is just about being human, realizing, I have to filch a few words from the Dalai Lama, that we're all alike and that we just want to be happy.
Right.
And I think what I've learned most is that unless you win the genetic roll of the happiness dice, because you can change it somewhat, but basically,
Right.
every time I see a happy kid, I'm thinking, he is lucky. Won't need so much Prozac
Right.
later. That most of us struggle all of our lives. And my idea about the spiritual eclectic movement is the same as any religion. Does it make us happier? Does it make us a little kinder? Does it develop a little bit of compassion? Don't people ask you all the time? What
All
is
the time.
spirituality?
All the
How does
time.
it differ from religion? How do I know if I'm spiritual? And if we want to know how the spiritual eclectic movement is going, we need to say, does it fulfill what we consider, quote, spiritual?
Yeah,
So
yeah.
what's spiritual?